this is fantastic. There's lots of people who care about our bears. We're really excited, and I'm not going to spend much time saying much of anything because I think you all know why you're here. We have some, this is sponsored by the Dummerston Conservation Commission and the Bonneville Environmental Education Center. There's donation jars in the back. If you want to put a little bit in, all that money goes to help pay just for benefits. We don't have anything else that goes for. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Ben Kelly.
I started working with black bears about 18 years ago, and I came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and hoped to go on to graduate school to do the kind of work I'm doing today, but unfortunately I'm dyslexic and my grade scores and test scores were well below par and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went west to the Colorado School of Trades and did a trade course in gunsmithing and have employed myself as a custom gunsmith over the last 30 years. And my wife, Debbie, and I, who's somewhere in the room, I guess she's still back by the table back there, and I came back to New Hampshire in 1982, I still had it in my mind that I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And I had a leg up on this because my father, Lawrence Killam, was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School and as an avocation studied birds. He did the book on the life histories of the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens, and it wrote many journal articles and other stories about nature. I grew up in a household with many wild animals around. When I was 2 years old, my dad was on sabbatical in Africa, and he brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. And over the years, we had everything from fox and woodchucks and skunks and great horned owls and falcons and hawks and just about everything imaginable around the house. And when my time came along, I obviously was taking in all this. I had an interest in carnivores, and carnivores presented a much greater problem to study. My dad prided himself on the fact that he could use a pair of binoculars and a small folding chair to do all his research. But carnivores, as you all know, if anybody who's walked through the forest, you rarely get a glimpse of them. They're just a fleeting streak going off through the woods. And so I thought about my early childhood experience, and I realized that if I got a hold of an orphaned animal and raised it loose in the forest acting as a surrogate mother, I could document its juvenile behavior and use that to understand and have access to its adult behavior. And I wasn't thinking about black bears at all because I had no access to black bears. But I was thinking about perhaps a coyote or a bobcat or maybe a fisher, the large woodland weasel we have around here. And to legally access one of those, my sister Phoebe and I became wildlife rehabilitators. And at the end of the first 2 years, none of those animals had come our way. But in the fall of the second year, a conservation officer brought an 11-month-old black bear cub to the house. And he'd broken departmental policy because at that time there was no rehabilitation of black bears in either Vermont or New Hampshire. And he was supposed to destroy the animal, and he was unwilling to do so. The animal was quickly confiscated from me because I had no permit to keep it. And later that year, the director of Fish and Game called me up and asked me if I'd take the animal back. And it turns out the animal had an ailment. The officer thought it had been hit by a car, but it had loose motor control and it would fall off branches and it was getting progressively worse. And I was interested in what was causing the problem because the reality is animals die all the time in the woods and we don't learn anything from them. And this was an opportunity to discover what was the problem of this animal. Ultimately, we had to euthanize it. And we sent the brain out to the Wyoming disease lab and got a diagnosis of lysosomal storage disease. And this is the first documented case of lysosomal storage disease in black bears. Lysosomal storage diseases and the like are usually found in domestic animals and in humans. It's Tay-Sachs disease in humans, and is caused by inbreeding. And it can spread through the population. Since that time, 2 more cases have come up in New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, and 1 more recently out in Wyoming. Later that spring, I got a call from Forrest Hammond from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife. He had 2 orphaned cubs that got orphaned during the Stratton Mountain Bear Study over at Stratton. And he'd heard about what my interests were in my research, and he interviewed me and asked me if I'd take those 2 cubs. And I said, well, there's this small problem of a permit. New Hampshire had never rehabilitated cubs. And I said, but if you contact New Hampshire Fish and Game and you can get a permit, I'll be happy to take the cubs. Well, the next morning we had a permit in hand. And over the last 18 years, we have rehabilitated and returned to the wild nearly 90 black bear cubs. The methods that I use in my research are very different from the scientific method. Due to my dyslexia, I didn't handle doing things other people's way very well. It was one of the problems in school. The course material was never a real problem. It was having to do it somebody else's way. And I found that if I did things my own way, things were very easy for me. So I simply designed my own way of doing science. And it involves observation, experience, and what I call systematic modeling. And that's a fancy term. I look at everything in this world as a system. And if I can define the system, I can figure out how it works. And as far as the bear's behavior is concerned, the more observations I make of behavior, the quicker I can start to assemble a model of how that whole behavioral system works. And the more pieces I get, the more information the model has, and then the model starts making predictions and sends me off on looking for things to fill in the missing pieces and so forth. I've reached the point now where I have a pretty good idea of the social behavior of black bears. And I found it to be quite complex. You won't be able to read this, but this is my model of the social behavior of black bears, and their social behavior is very different. They've been considered to be solitary by science, and basically not social. Social animals are wolves and chimpanzees, animals that live in territories with family groups inside the territory with hard hierarchies. The bears they don't have hard territories. The female bears their home ranges are as close to a territory as they get, but otherwise they're an open society. The female bears have reciprocal relationships with their neighboring females. They cooperate and communicate with unrelated animals. They've turned out to be much more interesting than the typical social behavior of other animals. And the only other animal that's similar to the bears in this type of behavior are humans. Because the humans are the only other animal that on a routine basis cooperate and communicate with unrelated individuals. All of this is because the food supply of the bear is the highest quality food that's available in the forest, and it's unevenly distributed across the landscape. The female home ranges are evenly distributed across the landscape, so at any given time, one female may have a huge surplus of food, let's say acorns in her home range, and her neighbor may have only beech and no food in her home range. And this leads to cooperation over the long haul. Oops. As I said, we've raised and rehabilitated over 90 cubs at this point, but the cubs that I use for my research were the very young cubs that came to me before they had any experience outside the den with their natural mother. These cubs I was able to walk in the forest, acting as a surrogate mother, taking them for walks up to 9 hours at a time and returning them safely to their remote enclosures that we kept them in. I was able to observe their very first reactions to the natural environment. I could see their tongues coming out and sticking to scent and lifting the tongue up with the saliva on their, lifting the scent up with the saliva on their tongue and offering it to a little bump inside their incisors called the papilla of the vomeronasal system. This was a very deliberate action. Bears and dogs and other mammals that are olfactory oriented have two olfactory systems, the vomeronasal system and the normal epithelial system, which we have. We only have one. They have two areas of the brain that these go to. The vomeronasal system goes to the accessory olfactory lobe of the brain, and the nasal epithelia goes to the olfactory lobe of the brain. And as these cubs approached the world, they picked up and identified all new objects with the vomeronasal system, and then slowly the nasal system would learn to locate and also identify what they had learned through the primary system. All of this would have not been able to be observed in an adult animal because the adults, the tongue still comes out, but it's so fast it's unobservable. Some of these bears I followed into adulthood. This is a bear named Yoda. She lived until she was 5.5 years old and raised one set of cubs. I literally could hold a video camera between her paws and film her tongue coming out as she licked up ants after she bit into a log or a stump. The main bear that I work with is a bear named Squirty. Squirty has been in all my films and my book. Squirty is now about 15 years old and has her 8th set of cubs up on the ridge in Lyme. She's waiting to emerge from the winter den. Squirty has been successful not only in establishing her own home range, but she's established a greater home range that she shares with daughters and granddaughters. She is now, I've defined what I call a matrilinear hierarchy, and Squirty, who's here, is the matriarch. She shares it with her currently her oldest daughter SQ2, a granddaughter SNLO, a younger daughter Brooke, and another granddaughter, adult granddaughter 2, and the youngest granddaughter, who's the daughter of SQ2, SQ2LO. And on site, Squirty will chase all the daughters and granddaughters below her. So she'll chase SQ2, SNLO, Brooke 2, and SQ2LO. It's linear because SQ2 will chase everybody below her, and everybody ends up chasing SQ2LO. And the result of this is that in a poor food year, Squirty will have access to the best foods that are available in the greater home range. And this ensures that at least one of the females will have access to enough food to reproduce. And in a major food year like this past year, all of the females will reproduce and have cubs. The other advantage there is that when Squirty was establishing the home ranges, she would break and fight for new territory, and each time she gained new territory and she had a daughter to place there, she'd place a daughter in that new ground and then move on and establish more new ground for herself and the next daughter. And so initially, during the berry season, when she should have been putting on weight, she'd be down to skin and bones because she was spending so much time dealing with disputes with neighbors and other bears. But now that she's surrounded by her family, she's able to carry weight from one year to the next, which also increases her chances of producing cubs on a regular basis. The young males that come into my study area, currently I'm going up to one of my pieces of property that's about a mile off the nearest town road. I go up in the evening with my pickup truck. I give a small reward of food to any bear that shows up while I'm there. And I've been able to observe about between 900 and 1,000 social encounters between bears. And any of the single male bears that come into the clearing are immediately chased off. This sequence here is Squirty chasing one of her grandsons he got chased by everybody, not only Squirty, but his aunts and so forth. But he got chased more than 30 times while I was watching, and by September, he left Squirty's greater home range into the resident population of the Upper Valley. The large male bears that showed up after the mating season that had mated with some of these adult females could take food from whoever they wanted to because of their size, but the females didn't tolerate this very long and would ask them to leave. And this is Squirty going after a 300-pound male. She weighs about 175 pounds in the picture. I filmed another occasion of SQ2, and she weighed 135 pounds, doing a stiff-legged walk, zigzagging in front of a 350-pound male, and he kind of backed off into the bushes like he really wasn't too concerned about the whole thing. But in the morning, he was gone, and he never returned. And this was an indication of female choice in mating, because these males, if there wasn't any repercussion, they would stay there and compete with the females and take their food and resources. The big surprise at the clearing was that there was a number of unrelated females that were welcomed into the clearing that shared Squirty's. This is the center of Squirty's home range. This is the area she controls the most. And she let these unrelated females in with no aggression towards them whatsoever. And this indicated that there was a reason that she wasn't aggressive towards them. It meant that she needed them. It meant that there was a greater society, that there was reciprocation taking place. And it turned out that the whole family, when we did the genetics using hair DNA and hair samples, this bear here was the matriarch, a bear we called Moose, and she was probably 6 or 8 years Squirty's senior. She had already been there when Squirty first entered the area. And it was nice because Squirty came from a population that was 60 miles north of Lyme, so I knew that she was unrelated with the resident bears, and I was able to see how these two clans mixed. And the only clan that's welcome into the Squirty's inner circle are relatives of Moose. This business of reciprocal contracts and cost counting leads to a whole other type of cognition. It's the type of cognition that humans are credited with being successful. It's the ability to count costs, to be able to calculate the value of all social and economic relationships, which is what we do on a regular basis throughout our lives. We figure out the costs and the benefits of every interaction. Social contracts, it takes me a long time to put words to behavior that I see. I have to pore through the literature and try to figure out what they're talking about. The science is great with words, but there's not often good representative things that show you that's exactly what they're dealing with. But I didn't understand social contracts until I set up this experiment that was duplicating an experiment done by Wolfgang Kohler in the 1920s, where he withheld food from chimpanzees to study insight. He was interested in tool use in chimpanzees at a very early stage, and he put food up where they couldn't reach it and scattered a bunch of boxes around to see if they could move the boxes in and pile them up and stand on them to get the food. And that doesn't sound like much, but animals typically use their environment, and it takes a big cognitive step to figure out how to manipulate something to gain access to something that was going on. It took Wolfgang Kohler's chimps 3 years, they were captive animals, to accomplish this task, so I didn't expect any great miracles from the bears. But I knew the bears were insightful because in my experience working with nuisance bears, that I know that if you want a bear on your roof, all you have to do is put a bird feeder on your roof. And bears will find and get food wherever they can smell it, and it doesn't matter how hard you work to keep them away or out of something, they'll figure out how to gain access to it. So I set up the experiment, and the first bear in was Squirty's oldest daughter at the time, Snowy, and she came in and she stood on her hind legs like this. She flexed her knees and judged that the bag of corn was too high for her to get at. And in the 2 minutes the remote camera was on and filming it, she climbed the tree, grabbed the rope in her mouth, snapped it twice, and the bag of corn broke loose and she got the corn. The next bear that came in was her oldest daughter, who was 80 pounds at the time, SNLO, and she came in and stood on the box and leapt for the bag and missed it. And then she climbed the tree, went arm over arm down the rope, grabbed the bag of corn under her arm, dropped off the rope, and got the corn. Well, the next bear that came in was Squirty, and I was there at the time and was able to film it. And Squirty came in, and this is Squirty in the picture, and she looked up at the bag of corn, and then she went over to the box and started biting big splinters out of the box, rolling it in the wrong direction. She went over to my remote video camera and started messing with that. She then came back to my truck and put both paws over the mirror on my truck, started rocking my truck while looking up at me as though she could break the mirror off the truck. I knew she could because she'd done it several times in the past. And I exclaimed no, and she went back to the video camera and started messing with it again. This all took place in about 2 or 3 minutes. She came back over to me. She did a symbolic bite at my knee, and then she bit me on the knee. And I produced a bag of corn. And I knew at this moment that Squirty and I had a social contract. And I've got to remind you that Squirty is very different from all the other bears that come into the clearing, because I raised her, and all the other bears that I raised in this fashion treat me like another bear. There's no inhibition between us. And so I've learned that because bears are altruistic, they're also punishers. And that bite to my knee was punishment. And it was a moral indignation of broken contract. I expect Squirty, it's about expectations and actions. Neither of us have a common language, and I expect Squirty to wear a radio collar. I expect to be able to change that without sedating her. I expect to be able to interfere with her life, occasionally bring in strangers like other biologists or film crews, and she expects the damn food be put on the ground. When she got done biting me on the knee, she immediately went into a soft, repetitive moan of reconciliation. And that's exactly the type of behavior that I would expect with this kind of moral contract. I went home that evening and... Yeah, a little bit. I went home that evening and I showed the film to my wife, Debbie, and I said, I said, this is a lot like our relationship. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, when humans get together in life, we fall in love, and all of a sudden this whole pile of chemicals goes loose in our brains. Oxytocin turns us into a crazy person, and next thing we know, we're married to a complete stranger. And then we have to work out the relationship with the most important partner of our life. And we're working it out with somebody we don't know their innermost thoughts, we don't know their history, we don't know what's going on, and we don't trust what they say, because as we all know, humans lie. And I realized that what was going on that in our relationship was very much the same as it was taking place in my relationship with Squirty. We each have expectations of each other's behavior, and we judge each other by actions. As soon as one of our actions exceeds the expectation of another, there's this big emotional blast that corrects the situation, followed up with reconciliation. And that's exactly the same thing that took place with Squirty and I. And it was really something to realize that despite our technological gains and our culture, that we still manage social contracts exactly the same way that a pre-human animal might have done it 6 or 7 million years ago. I wondered what the male bears were doing that was comparable to the reciprocal relationships in females between the unrelated females, and I it's very difficult to study male bears because if you put a telemetry collar on a male bear, he goes over a mountain and then he disappears. The male bear's home ranges can be up to 200 square miles. You can put a collar on a male bear in Lyme, and he might be down here in Dummerston and up in Quebec a few months later. They travel widely. They're not the same male bears in a community in any given year. They're moving that much. And so I decided to monitor the bears that were inside my study area using trail cameras. And I put a small amount of corn, about a gallon, what one bear can easily eat all by itself. And I put them in areas where there's a surplus of food. In this case, it was a clear cut that had been growing up. It was about the end of its productivity in 2008. And I filmed 8 to 10 different males inside that clear cut. And in 2009, there were no male bears in that clear cut, only the resident female. And I'd known from the past, from observing Squirty at the clearing, that any single male bear that came into a female home range quickly got asked to leave. He didn't have any choice about sticking around. But something curious took place while I was filming. I had an awful lot of pictures of 2 male bears in front of the camera at the same time sharing that very small amount of food. And this indicated that there were friendships and coalitions taking place. And I realized that the subadult males, their strategy for getting surplus food inside female home ranges was to band together as a group of friends and come in mass. So there was too many of them for the female bears to chase out. And this is very similar to the strategy used by ravens that Bernd Heinrich had documented. Bernd Heinrich had noticed that when there was a kill, if an unmated raven discovered it, he'd start broadcasting the location of the kill. And he wondered why he didn't just go down, get a meal, and fly off. Well, it turns out if he went down to get a meal, the territorial pair would come in and chase him clear out of the county, and he wouldn't get anything to eat. But if he broadcast the location of the meal, any other raven, unmated bird that heard his broadcast would show up, and about 15 ravens would go down, and now they overpowered the territorial pair, and they all got a meal, and they're all able to be happy. The difference is that these bears are not broadcasting, they're making social friendship relationships with, these are all unrelated males. They're not brothers or anything like that. And so this is very similar to group formation in humans. And again, it's the only species of animals that this has been documented in. This type of thing is not seen in chimpanzees or gorillas or anything like that. Oops. All of this is about access to food. In the spring of the year, the bears eat what I call emerging growth. There's a period of time while the buds are turning into leaves and the leaves are forming, that the nutrients are free-flowing and accessible before cellulose hardens off and makes them unavailable. These cubs are climbing a red oak tree to eat the oak leaf starts as the oak buds first break into leaves. There's an abundance of food available to the bears at this time, and most importantly, it's evenly distributed on the landscape. These bears will be eating beech buds when they first swell this time of year, and then the beech leaf starts, and then the beech leaves. They'll be eating nodding sedge in the woodland trails, clover, grass on the edges of meadows. Again, there's just an abundance of food this time of year, but none of it will make the bears fat. Because it is evenly distributed on the landscape, this is the time of year the bears pick for their mating season. And the female bears come into estrus beginning in the last week of May and on to the first week of July. The male and female bear will spend about 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union will be a 2-celled organism called a blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so that blastocyst won't implant into the uterus until late November, early December. And then there's a short gestation period of 50 to 55 days, and the cubs are born in the dead of winter in January, weighing less than a pound, with their eyes shut and their little ear flaps down. They continue to develop inside the den. And they are not even able to follow their mother until they emerge on about the 15th from the winter dens on about the 15th of April. The first thing the mother bear does is to build a nest at the bottom of a good climbing tree and coaches her cubs the very first time they go up the tree. They have to learn about dead bark, smooth bark, and the skinny end of a limb. Once the cubs are adept climbers, she will then start to move them to better feeding areas. By the first or second week of May, they can easily follow behind her, and she'll move them from babysitting tree to babysitting tree. These babysitting trees are large pine trees or oaks, and the cubs will sleep in the trees, play in the trees, and feed in the trees. The mother bear will radiate out of the base, feeding and getting her food. And if she hears the cub's toenails making noise climbing on the bark, she'll come running rapidly back to the tree. The cubs will spend the entire first year with their mother and den with her in the winter den that year. And the family breakup takes place the following June when the male shows up. This past summer, this last spring, I was very fortunate to watch to be able to observe the courtship and pre-courtship and courtship of the black bears. This is Squirty's granddaughter, SNLO, and her mate. And this male bear was quite a beast. This is at my clearing, and I was able to sit inside my pickup truck with them about 10 or 15 feet away to get these pictures, so I was perfectly safe. This male bear I called the bear on steroids. I used to think that a male bear, because of the amount of time he spent with a female, could possibly mate with 3 females during the season. Only the very largest and most aggressive males do all the mating, the top 10 or 15%. This bear showed up at the clearing on June 16th, about halfway through the mating season, and mated with 5 females that I knew about in that period, which included all of Squirty's gang and also all of Moose's gang, which made both clans more closely related. But when the male shows up, the female doesn't know him that well. She's been with her yearlings. When at the clearing at this past year, Squirty and SQ2 and SNLO all had yearlings with them. And when the male showed up, he went over and checked the condition where these females had laid down. He would check their scent to see what condition they were in, how close they were to estrus. And when they got close to him, they'd go up, they send their cubs up a tree, and then they'd go up halfway and they'd look down at him with interest and still give him a hard time. And if he got too close, they'd drop out of the tree and chase him off to protect their cubs. But the second day that he was there, Squirty showed up without cubs and went up to this big guy and said, "Hey, big guy, you're coming with me," and led him off into the forest. The last female to come into estrus was SNLO, and she, again, everything took place at the clearing. She was very aggressive with him when he first showed up. She'd put her head down and go, "Ho, ho, 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 ho," which meant back off, I'm not happy about you being here. And he, with lots of experience, would just hold his head high with confidence. When he first approached her, he made a very soft, seductive chirp, indicating his intentions. They went around the clearing with this open mouth display, which lasted about 45 minutes, getting used to each other. Very dramatic behavior. And then finally, after the 45 minutes, he was able to catch her for the first time. He would bite her behind the neck. Bears are stimulated ovulators. It ensures the stimulation of the bite behind the neck and all the aggression of mating. Ensures that the female will ovulate precisely at the time they mate, so that the ovulation will take place and conception will take place. This first couple only lasted a few minutes, and then they disappeared into the forest for about 20 minutes. They came back out and went back into the pre-courtship behavior for another 30 or 40 minutes. And finally, he caught her again, and this time they hooked up for about 45 minutes. And I literally mean hooked up, because bears have a baculum like a dog, which locks over the pelvis so that they're locked in the mating position for that full 45 minutes. There were other bears in the clearing at the time, and they'd come walking by, rubbernecking, seeing what was going on. At the end of the 45 minutes, they decoupled and headed off into the forest, and that's all I was able to observe. 85% of the bear's diet is vegetative matter. The balance is animal protein, and of that 10 or 15% that's animal protein, 90 to 95% is ants, bees, and grubs. And having said that, bears are opportunists, and they will, if they have the opportunity, they'll take a deer fawn or a moose calf. They'll take a bird's nest or a fledgling bird off a branch. They'll occasionally take domestic animals, but bears are not true predators. They don't respond to movement or sound like a fisher or coyotes or things like that do. This is Squirty licking up ants. I used to tell people that bears ate ants 10 or 15 times a day. I was with Squirty one afternoon, and she was biting into logs and licking up colonies of ants, and she was finding and cleaning out colonies of ants at the rate of 40 to 60 an hour. This is Yoda eating blackberries. Bears eat their food one piece at a time. I used to go in on the radio signal and spend time with these bears in the woods and travel with them, and I'd take a small food reward of dog food, and it would take Yoda 35 minutes to eat that small bag of dog food. If I gave that same bag of dog food to my Labrador buddy, he would inhale it in about a minute and a half. The summer vegetative foods of the black bears all grow in moist, rich soils along rivers and streams, in the base of mountains where you might find red maple and white ash growing. There's three primary plant species or succulents. One is jewelweed, which grows in everybody's yard in the springtime. There's three species of wild lettuce, and the most important is jack-in-the-pulpit. The jack-in-the-pulpit has a root or a corm that's their major root crop that's more nutritious than either beechnuts or acorns. They feed on it from the size of a dime to the size of a baseball. In years when there's a shortage of nuts, they'll feed heavily on jack-in-the-pulpit. It's these summer vegetative foods that bring bears and people close together. The bear's summer habitat is in the valleys where the rich soils are, and that happens to be where we've developed for the same reason, for those rich soils. So it's not an unusual event here in Vermont or New Hampshire for somebody to have a nicely mowed lawn leading up to an orchard that maybe has cover of interrupted fern, maybe 3 feet high. For a black bear to be feeding right outside the mowed lawn, you'd never know it was there unless you went out and saw the stompled trails and the occasional divot where it was digging jack-in-the-pulpit. You'd never know the bear was there unless the bear's nose went up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has twice the calories per unit of any of their natural foods. And bears prioritize food by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. So, in my experience, the amount of black oil sunflower seed that's usually served up is between 5 and 35 pounds at a time. So, it's not unusual for a bear to come in and get a day's pay in about 15 minutes. Bears need to put on 30% of their body weight in fat just to survive the winter months of hibernation. A female bear that's going to give birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to give birth and to nurse those cubs and to have enough extra weight to feed them in the springtime. If you want to understand why bears behave the way they do around food, just think about the way we behave around money. Bears have to store food to get through the winter months. We store money in the bank for our retirement, to put our kids through school, to buy a boat or a yacht, and we behave exactly the same way around money as bears do around food. Just think for a moment of scattering $10 bills all around your lawn and expecting nobody to come and pick any of them up. I was working, the last film that I did with National Geographic, we were working up in the White Mountains with a bear at a dumpster that they'd salted with donuts. And feeling sorry for the bear, I suggested that we take $101 bills and lead a trail up to the dumpster and mix the rest of the $1 bills in with all those donuts and slop that was in the dumpster, and then leave a couple of remote cameras up to catch who would come into the dumpster and go to lunch. And they didn't have a very good sense of humor. The main fall foods that put the adequate fat on the bears in Vermont and New Hampshire are red oak acorns and beech nuts. The red oak is primarily in the central and southern parts of the state, and the beech to the north and the eastern and western parts of the state. Whoops. I know dens fascinate people. The den I'm crawling out of here is a den that Yoda built for both her maternal den and for her den for her yearlings. She'd excavated it under this old root mass of a tree that blew over many years ago. And when I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots that kept the soil from collapsing down around the cubs during the winter. These are pretty typical of excavated dens. They're not very good at digging through live roots. They like exposed soil. They like well-drained soil. You often find these dens on a hummock or the top of a ridge where the winter melt-off won't run in and flood out the den. Other bears use different strategies. This particular bear built what we call an open ground nest. These are usually in dense softwood regeneration, but this one happened to be right in a hardwood clear cut. The situation is pretty typical, right up next to a log. She bit the old rotted wood off the log to line her den with, and she took advantage of the winter sun to raise her cubs, to give birth and raise her cubs. They also use rock dens, and these are the rocks that have just tumbled off the ledges over the years. They're not true caves or anything. These make our winter den work very difficult because the bear can get down into a hole that's not much bigger than its head. Their bodies are very supple. Their shoulders are very fluid. And it's often difficult to sedate a bear and get her out of one of these winter rock dens. Here's a yearling bear with her mother in the rock den. And the final type of den are tree dens. These, I think, bears would use all the time if there were more big trees. When trees get to be about 3 feet in diameter, their centers can rot and slump out completely, so that the live part of the tree is only about 3 inches thick, leaving a huge cavity inside. And if there's any kind of an opening at all, the bears will go down into the stem of the tree and spend their winters there. This particular tree was near a new residential area in Lyme. The woman gave me a call and said there was a bear in her tree, and I got there, and sure enough, there was a bear in her tree. And I let her know that the bear had been in her tree all winter long. Whoops. We always, sometimes I go up to the clearing every night from the time the snow leaves until the time the fall comes, unless I have something that drags me away, like giving a lecture. And many nights nothing ever happens, and things are pretty routine. But 2 years ago now, Squirty came down off the hill with a single male cub. Her daughter, SQ2, had triplets. And in the middle of May, I got a call from somebody who was living in SQ2's home range. He was concerned. He saw the cubs feeding on acorns. He said 2 of the cubs were very vigorous and playing. The 3rd cub was lethargic, spending time sleeping up in a tree, lagging behind the group when they moved, not playing with the other 2. And I explained to him that bears are not unlike hawks and owls. It depends on the availability of food and the aggressiveness of the cubs in getting milk from their mother. But in a poor food year, only the aggressive cubs are going to get enough milk to survive. It's not unusual for a mother to give birth to 3 cubs and raise 2, or give birth to 2 cubs and raise 1. I said, don't be surprised if she shows up with just 2 cubs one day. Well, about a week after that, I was at the clearing. Both SQ2 and Squirty were wearing GPS collars, so I knew exactly what was taking place. It was the first time that she'd been there that year. I was leaving the clearing about dusk, and SQ2 showed up next to the trail. I stopped. She had a very emotional look on her face. She tried to lead me off in the woods, and I couldn't do much about it. I knew something was up. The next day, I was unable to be at the clearing. I had to give a lecture. And I got a call at about 4 o'clock from another neighbor that was about a half a mile away. They said that SQ2 had been in their field that morning, but now there was a cub at the top of a large pine bawling its head off. And I said, well, she knows how many cubs she has, and she'll be back for that cub if she needs to. The next night I went to the clearing, and Squirty was there. I saw her cub above her, and while I was there, a big male bear came out, and suddenly 2 cubs ran up above Squirty, and then Squirty went up the tree below them, and I said, what's going on here? And it turns out that Squirty had adopted her granddaughter, and that adoption had taken place in a single night. All the terms of that contract and that adoption held for the rest of the cub raising period, and it was enforced throughout that time. I saw it many times over the summer. Both SQ2 with her 2 male cubs were there, while Squirty and her granddaughter and her cub were at the clearing 40 feet apart. There were times when all 3 of SQ2 cubs were up the same tree. I called this one Josie. Josie would come down and run to Squirty. The 2 males would come down and run to their natural mother. And it's pretty remarkable that bears are able to make that kind of advanced contract. And that's pretty complicated stuff. And it also shows a high level of empathy, the fact that SQ2 knew that her mother would empathize with her position and possibly adopt her daughter. The cubs have a very social type of play. The closer they get to being on their own, the more they do it. They start out on the ground with an open mouth wrestle and then quickly accelerate into a bipedal stance, pushing each other back and forth, reminiscent of a waltz or perhaps a sumo type wrestle. Some biologists call this mock fighting. I found it to be anything but. It's actually a ritual of friendship or food sharing. I have a remote video that I took in one of my monitoring cameras of a large male coming in to eat that small amount of corn in front of the camera, and while the camera was running, a second large male came in and skirted around him, honoring his position, opened his mouth. They did the open mouth wrestle. They stood up and wrestled. And they laid down and shared that small amount of corn in front of the camera. One would expect with complex social behavior there would be complex communication. Bears, one of the things I've discovered about bears is that I discovered an organ in their nose that allows them to assess airborne or aromatic compounds in the air with their vomeronasal system. And because of this, the bears do their long-range communication with scent, and they're able to identify who's coming in. When a bear is receiving scent, her head's held up like that, and she opens and closes her mouth, expelling moist air out of her lungs and then drawing it back through her nasal system. Bears, unlike dogs, when Squirty smells a bear that she likes, she'll get a beautiful look on her face. It might be her mate. It's still 10 minutes out. She gets a puff of his scent. And if she gets a puff of a scent of a bear she doesn't like, she may start false charging and swatting the ground and carrying on, even though he's still 10 minutes out or 15 minutes out. So they react emotionally to the scent of the bear that they smell in the air. The animals that lack this organ that I discovered all have long-range vocal communications. The panda doesn't have it, so it has a bleat. The chimpanzees have a pant hoot. The wolves howl, and so forth. The bears have no long-range vocal communication. The bears are also highly expressive. They have emotional expression on their face, which is an honest expression. It comes from the central nervous system, so you can read the bear's mood. Squirty in this picture has just put one of her cubs after weaning up a tree. It shows that she's irritated. She's got a frown on her face. Her ears are back. The meaning of the ears are like the ears of a horse. When they're pinned back, they're angry. And then here's Squirty with a happy face. And they have a wide range of expressions in between. The thing that really sets bears apart from other animals is that most animals communicate only with emotion, and bears also have an expression of intention. And when they are being expressive with intention, they now generate these sounds and actions mechanically. They'll chomp their teeth, they'll huff, they'll swat, and they'll false charge. And the meaning of each of these expressions is based on the context of the situation. These are one-to-one communications when two bears meet in the forest. And if you are on a trail and you run across a sow and her cubs are already up a tree and she false charges you, she's just trying to delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. Now, if you're working at a restaurant and you're carrying a pail of food scraps out to the dumpster and a bear false charges you, he simply wants you to drop the pail of food scraps before you put them in the dumpster. I was with Squirty one afternoon up on the ridge in Lyme, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and this thunderhead came rumbling in. Squirty false charged the thunderhead. And believe it or not, the thunderhead turned and went away, and the sun came back out. Here's Squirty lifting scent off an object, again expelling moist air out of her lungs. Bears are also able to follow each other's scent to find food and to follow each other's scent to punish. And as I've described, bears are an altruistic society. They share food, and because they do that, they have to have a judicial system or a mechanism of punishment. The bear's judicial system is much superior to our own. A bear can smell who's done something wrong and then track it down and exact the punishment it needs to exact. We have DNA and fingerprinting, but we have to get it off the perpetrator and then match it up with him at a later date. The bear's punishment is commensurate with a crime. I've been having raised Squirty and the other bears that I've raised, I'm very familiar with their punishment. The young cubs are very much like human children when you raise them. They manipulate their mothers with pain and pleasure. They make ornery sounds and cry when they're unhappy or hungry, and then when they're happy they make very content sounds. And if you further misbehave, they'll bite you and not bite you when they're being good. They also have deliberate marking while they're in the forest. In this sequence, you might argue this bear is not deliberately marking that sapling that it's crawling under, getting its sebaceous oils, which are long-lasting marks on the sapling. But this is a different bear, same sapling, and this time she's grabbing the sapling over her head and rubbing it on her back and making sure she gets all the sebaceous oil she can possibly on that sapling. The most common way bears get together during the mating season is at these red pine bear trees. These trees have been bit repeatedly over the years, and this is the fresh bite mark right there. A male bear, when he's advertising his location for the female to find him, she may have already chosen who she wants to mate with, but she still has to locate him at the right time. He will back rub on the tree. He'll getting all the sebaceous oil he can on the tree with his paws out and rubbing and flexing his knees, and then he'll turn his head and bite the tree to release the sap of the tree. The sebaceous oils are low volatility. They have very little smell. By biting the tree, they're releasing the aromatic sap of the tree to advertise the mark. So the bears were the first advertisers. The red pine has the most aromatic compounds of any of our natural trees. They also use telephone poles for the same reason. They're made out of red pine trees and have aromatic compounds put on them as preservatives. Once the female bear locates the male she wants, she'll rub on the tree and wait for him to come back. When they hook up, they'll get out of dodge. These mature male bears will have an entourage of younger males that follow them around or mentor from them. And so wherever the female's going, her condition of estrus is being put out on the airwaves, also attracting other male bears. And so wherever the female bear goes, the male bear will set up a 2-acre breeding territory around her. And he will back rub and bite trees and leave stiff-legged sunken footprints in a circle, about a 2-acre circle around wherever she happens to be feeding. Here's the male bear traveling with a female, back rubbing, then biting the tree, and then looking pretty proud of himself. A few years ago, I went to the National Zoo down in Washington. The panda is the one bear that doesn't have the organ that I discovered, so I wanted to try some scent out on the panda to see how it responded. And I'd read everything I could about pandas, about their social behavior, but it wasn't until I actually met the panda that I realized how different it was. It probably is truly a social animal, a solitary animal, and by solitary I mean that the only time that it spends time with others of its own kind are during cub raising and during mating. That there's none of this reciprocity and social interaction for food and stuff taking place. And what stunned me about the panda was that the panda had no facial expression. It couldn't move its ears, and whatever eye expression it had was blacked out by these big black blobs over its eyes. Since going to the National Zoo, I have gone to China and presented my work about raising black bear cubs to the Chengdu Panda Base. And I did that in 2008. And this last year, the Chengdu Panda Base became partners with the group that I went to China with. And I'll be returning to China on April 20th. To begin working with them on the reintroduction of pandas. They have been successfully captively breeding pandas, but they haven't put any back into the wild. And so I'll be working closely using my methods as the model for the reintroduction. To end up tonight, I have a quick visual sequence I call Houdini's Apple Tree Olympics, so hang on. And finally is dismount. Thank you very much. Somebody can get the lights, I'll take a few questions.
Can we have some questions?
Sure, just somebody ought to get the lights so I can.
The panda bear sounds very unique compared to the black bears you say around here. How about other bears around the world? Are they more like the black bear or more like the panda bear?
The panda bear is very different from the rest of the bears. It's considered a more primitive bear. The rest of the bears around the world are quite closely related to the black bear. The only one that's more distantly related is the spectacled bear or the Andean bear in South America, and that's what's considered a short-faced bear. But there's still, the short-faced bear, the Andean bear, still has the organ that I discovered, which makes it in the same group, but just a little bit more primitive.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
I can remember my mother talking about to hear a bear.
Mm-hmm.
They hoot.
Question is about bears hooting.
Explain this.
The question is about bears hooting, and it's been a long time myth in both Vermont and New Hampshire that bears have long-range communication by hooting. Unfortunately, it's the only place. There's 750,000 black bears in all of North America, and the only black bears that hoot are in Vermont and New Hampshire. It's more than likely barred owls or mourning doves or things like that. Yes, in the back.
I have a couple of compost bins that bears have just ripped open and sat down and ate. I don't want to stop composting. How do I keep a bear?
Well, the best thing to do with composting to keep the bears away is to control the smell of the compost. So any new food that you put in, tuck it underneath the already stuff that's composted. Don't put it on top of the pile where it's going to create an odor. And otherwise, put sawdust on top of food to control smell. It takes very little. It's all about keeping bears out of things. Is about controlling smell. You know,
Not building a concrete
But again, if you use wood chips or sawdust or wood ash that's coming out of these power plants, all those things are good at absorbing smell. And then putting the fresh stuff underneath the old stuff and things like that. Next to you, yeah.
How long do bears live usually?
How long do they what?
How long do they live?
How long do bears live? There have been there was a black bear in a Minnesota study that was in the news last year or the year before that was 37 years old and still producing cubs. In captivity, they've lived till 45. As I like to say, with Medicare and Medicaid, they might go to 70. Yes.
I'm interested to know hear a little more about what you do about acclimating young bears that you've raised to go back out in the wild.
What do I do to say that word again. Acclimate young bears to go back into the wild. The fortunate thing is that bears don't want to be human, so it doesn't. My interaction with them, by walking them, I gave them an opportunity to learn, and that's what they needed. They needed the safety of somebody to be with as they traveled across the landscape and was able to learn. Bears want to be bears. When Squirty and her gang of cubs came of age and all the other cubs that we raised, the first thing they did at weaning time, and weaning time came just at the same time as with the wild cubs, they went off and started traveling with other bears. I suspect that bear Moose that Squirty shares her inner circle with is the same bear that Squirty was traveling with, and she actually false charged me protecting Squirty and her brother from me. So they make friends. They have the social ability to communicate with strangers, and as I say, they make friends very easily. The young male bears this last year, one of SQ2's sons formed a relationship with probably a 3-year-old male that was about his same size. They wrestled at the clearing, they played, and they left together, traveling together as friends. So bears want to be bears, and that's why it all works, is just giving them the opportunity. Yes?
So can you talk about the
problems of bird feeders?
Can I talk about the problems with bird feeders? Well, the problem is nothing ever good results, especially for the bear, of having a bear close to a human's home. One, if you have attractants, and that's anything that they can smell, and if you want to keep bears out of anything, including the compost, a baited electric fence is the way to go. And by baited, I mean you put smell on the wire. And bears, they access all new smell by sticking their tongue out to find out what it is. And then they get zapped on their tongue, and they don't want any part of what's behind the wire after that. That works for bees, it works for compost, it works for bird feeders. But the problem is that when you're bird feeding, you're feeding wildlife. You know, you're feeding whatever comes in. And bears happen to be the biggest form of wildlife we have around here. And some of the cubs we get every year for rehabilitation have been shot by people who are protecting their bird feeder from bears. And, you know, it's just unfortunate. A female bear with cubs that's in your neighborhood is your female, your resident female. She'll spend her entire life in 3 to 5 square miles, which your property is included in. And that's her home. If you call up Fish and Game and want to relocate it, you're taking her out of her home, which she needs in order to raise cubs. She needs that area. And you're dumping her where she's not welcome. And so there's really no good, the best thing to do is learning to live with bears and not attract them around residential areas. They can live perfectly happily with us without any problems. They're not a threat to our safety. The last person killed in New Hampshire was in 1780. The last person killed in Vermont was in 1940, but he shot a bear and wounded it and tried to gut it, and the bear woke up and gave him a bear hug. And bear's punished. Yes?
I actually eliminated my problem by hanging my feet on a wire about 15 feet high. The bear can't jump up and get it. And I also confess I shot a bear in the butt with a pellet gun. And my distinct impression was the bear was more insulted and not injured at all. And it left and never came back. And I haven't had a bear problem since then.
Well, there's many ways of trying to keep bears out, but the reality is if there is food there, they do get attracted. And if you live with lots of other people around, you're exposing other people to something they might be terrified of. And they might end up calling the authorities. And, the authorities respond. I mean, police officers often shoot bears for public safety because they're not trained themselves in how to handle wildlife situations. Fish and game departments, I don't know how many good biologists that have just given up on bears because of the public that complains so much. It's not the bears. It's just being harassed by the public enough to where the easy thing to do is to shoot the bear because the bear can't speak back. So it is very important to learn to cohabitate with these animals. There's plenty of time to feed bears, feed birds during the winter time. And the reality is, when I was a kid, nobody fed birds. The economy wasn't good enough. We didn't have the extra resources to put food out. Yes?
How do you think our weird winter will have affected bears? Because they den really late.
Question is, how does our weird winter affect the bears? It really doesn't affect them very much because the female bears that are going to have cubs go to den first when they get fat enough, and they can go in as early as mid-October and as late as the 1st of December. The cubs, the ones with yearling cubs go to bed second, and then the male bears go to bed last. In a year like this, that we had a big beach year and an open winter, there were male bears out feeding on beech nuts most of the winter. I had reports from foresters and antler hunters and people like that of bears out in January and February and stuff. Now, people say bring in your feeders by the 1st of April. Well, this year it was the 1st of March, that's all. That's the difference. Yes?
When you're introducing a cub back into the wild, they can't feed them
When I'm in it, they don't need a mother.
Model.
The cubs that these young cubs that I've raised, I've basically I've walked them, and that gives them the opportunity to learn. And they have within them, within their genome, everything they need to respond to their natural environment. And the most important thing they need is that opportunity to learn. They have it all in them, and that's what I'll take to China with me. The Chinese right now believe that humans have to teach bears how to be wild, and that's not the case at all. And we're the same way. We're born with everything we need to be human. And it's surprising how much of us is instinct, and even though we have our culture and everything else.
Can you speak to what your facility is like? I mean, how big it is?
Our facility is the question. We have an indoor facility which is 20 by 32 and with a 10 by 20 insulated area. Then we have an 8-acre forested enclosure which the cubs are raised in. And so they form their own social group. There will be a lead female who controls the pack. These are all bears coming from different places, so they'll all end up as one big social entity, unless cubs come in late, and then they have a little more difficult time getting into the group. But it's worked very well. Yes?
In your book, you say that there's about 5 or 6 different bear sounds that you know the meaning of. Excuse me. Can you demonstrate some of them?
Well, there's more than that. The female, when she's managing her cubs, which she does very well, she does it much better than I could do it, but she uses a gulp to pull them down out of the tree, or to lead them away, or to steer them through difficult times, and it's and the male bear will use the same sound when he's with the female and wants her to move along and go where he wants to go, or just keep on going. There's that sound of disdain, which is which is always a negative sound. And then there's the chomping of teeth, which can be complaining or nervous. And huffing, which they do to kind of, usually in retreat. It seems to be something they're covering their retreat with. And there's a lot of small chirp sounds, like that seductive sound of the male, that and the moan of recognition, the reconciliation is a soft, repetitive moan. It's the same kind of thing. Squirty would use that same sound when she approached me directly, because when a bear approaches you directly, it knows it's threatening you. If you want to be aggressive to a bear, you walk right straight towards it if you want it to leave your yard or do something like that. So when Squirty would walk towards me directly, she would also make that soft, repetitive moan, letting me know that she wasn't a threat to me, that she was coming in with an appeasement sound. But there was a wide variety of things that I can recognize. Yes?
So you mentioned a comment about taking the bears for a walk so they can learn to be bears. When you're doing it, are you getting sounds like a female would do?
The question was, when I walked the cubs, did I make sounds like the female bear did? No, I did not. I'm not smart enough to do that. The bears can read our emotional communication better than we understand it ourselves. And that's the intensity, the emotional inflection in our words, and our intentional aspects of our actions and our sound. And so all I had to use was English, and they knew what I was up to.
I was going
Yes.
to ask you to define this walk that you do with the bears. Is it something you go out once with them, or?
Well, when we were doing it, right now we don't do it as much. We have a new set of cubs this year that we may do it a little bit. But with the 8-acre enclosure, that really has made it a lot easier, because they have an area. 8 acres is large, and it's forested, and that they can learn almost everything they need in there. But when we did walk them, my primary interest was in learning behavior. So I did it 5-6 times a week. I'd be out for 3 to 9 hours at a time.
And they'd come back with you?
they'd come back with me. They'd follow me anywhere I wanted to go. So if we found some exciting scent at a bear tree, one day I could go back the next day and see the decline of behavior. And I could do whatever I wanted to with them because they'd go wherever I wanted to go.
So this 8 acres is enclosed?
It's enclosed. It has a high tensile electric fence with a deer fence, plastic deer fence on it.
And when you're ready to release them, you just open up a gate?
No, we release them. They're currently, we use hard releases. There is a full bear population in my study area, and I'm studying the resident bears that are there. And if they were released locally, they'd just be pushed out of the area. Currently, we're taking them to northern New Hampshire, and we have a site in a large area of woods near Wentworth, New Hampshire. There's a graduate student this year and next year that's been putting GPS collars on our released cubs. And he found this year he had 7 cubs with GPS collars. They all stayed in the forested area that they were released in. They all fed up on the ridges with beech nuts. Not one of them went to anywhere near any human houses. And every one of them came from residential situations where the mother was shot on somebody's porch or things like that. And all the old myths that cubs couldn't be truly rehabilitated, that they'd have the habits of their mother and they'd go back to doing their mother's things, just have not borne out to be true. Fish and Game is just terribly happy with the results of the cubs. We've done 90 of them, and they just don't show up again. They go right back into the wild population.
So your next release will be to another different area?
When they just radiate out of those areas eventually. The GPS collars were on them just for till the end of their second year. Yes?
How do we take care of the bears before they leave?
What's that?
Before they leave, how do you take care of them?
How do I take them before they're weaned? Bottle feeding 3 times a day, middle of the night. Ask Debbie right now. We don't get much sleep until the weaning time comes.
You give them cow's milk?
We give them lamb's milk replacer, sweetened up with a little apple juice. That's mainly because you can use Epsilac or human's milk replacer, but lamb's milk replacer is relatively inexpensive, and you can buy it in bulk. And they're perfectly happy with it. They do well on it. Yes?
Does it matter the age or size of the bears when the students put these GPS collars on them? Because they do grow quite a bit.
Does it matter the age or the size of the bear when we put the GPS collars on? The cubs that we raise typically get overfed, so they're already large, and when they go back out in the wild, they actually shrink to the quality of the habitat that they go into. And these collars were all put on with drop-offs so that the collars dropped off before they went to den.
So how old were they? 2 years, a year or so?
They were monitored from the release time in June until the collars dropped off at denning time. So that was from a year and a half to 2 years old. Yes?
Other than humans, who are the natural predators of the black bear?
Other than humans, who are the natural predators of the black bear? The biggest loss of life is the starvation of cubs. If a mother doesn't put on an adequate amount of fat and gives birth to cubs, when she runs out of milk, she automatically goes into estrus. It attracts males. By that time, the cubs may have already gotten weakened and died of hypothermia or been exposed to the male. When they get weakened, like if the mother doesn't have enough milk, the coyotes might grab them. Coyotes have been known to harass yearling bears. Bears don't like coyotes, so I mean that's an indication. They certainly can get grabbed by eagles or any big bird of prey. When they're young, they are. And in fact, they have brown spots on the back of their ears when they're young, which act as eye spots to protect them from behind. Yes.
Are pandas related more to raccoons than bears? Does that?
Well, that was, the question was, are pandas more related to raccoons than bears? That was thought at one time, but when DNA came along and they were able to do DNA sequences on them, they determined that they were more related to bears than. They're just a very primitive bear.
An early bear.
Yeah, and they eat just bamboo. They don't have any specialized means of identifying food. The organ that I discovered, aside from reading aromatic compounds in the air, it also allowed them to identify plants, whether they were edible or not.
And is that how they know who they're related to? How do they know that?
Well, they know how they're related to, which is also important. They know that from scent, even though I haven't been able to prove that yet because it's a little too expensive to do the. I collected a bunch of scent, but to run them through the mass spec is a little expensive. But the other indication that they can recognize their relatives is that their brown markings on their face reflect the mother and father. You can see, and they're very dominant genes because not only will identical females show up, but there'll be identical males and females with identical markings that reflect their mother and father. And so that represents some recognition of family members.
So it's visual.
A visual.
Wow.
Yes.
I have this impression that if I'm hiking and I run across a black bear in this area, it's not to be concerned, they're more shy than the grizzly bears would be if you start with a grizzly bear out west. I'm just wondering if that's accurate impression.
Question is about hiking around here and encountering a black bear versus a grizzly bear out west. The black bears are more likely to be shy around here. The black bears, because they share food, they think highly of those that they get food from. And there's not a black bear in New Hampshire or Vermont that hasn't gotten food in somebody's backyard at some point in time. So they're not scared of us. They know us. That it's not a high-stress situation for the bear when you encounter a bear. You might be a high-stress person, but it won't be a high-stress bear. Where most of the death and injury from black bears take place is in northern Canada and northern Alaska, where bears don't see people. So you end up with high-stress person, high-stress bear. Having said that, the chances black bears have killed 57 people in the last 100 years in all of North America. That's from Mexico to northern Canada. So there's very slim odds of being killed by a black bear. Basically, it's important. I think it's important. That's why I try to teach behavior. To learn and understand the bear's behavior. In my films and in my book, I describe a lot of it. I do what I can in these talks. But basically, if you meet a bear on the trail, and especially if it's a female whose cubs are already up a tree, she's going to do some pretty typical things sometimes. And that would be false charge you. She'd just rush and swat the ground, scare the daylights out of you. If you've never had it happen before, they're real good bluffers. She might circle you, and if she circles you, all she wants to do is find out who you are. She wants to smell your back trail, to know who's your scent. She'll come right back to her cubs. And if you can control your emotions, if you can keep your eyes on her the whole time, you always want to be strong, your eyes are your strength. Talk softly to her. That'll let her know by the tone of your voice, your emotions, that you're not a threat to her, and in 10 or 15 minutes she'll leave. Could care less what you do, where you walk, or where you go. She'll determine that you're not a threat. And in my experience, the bears are the only animal that are able to read our emotional communication and react to it. All other animals just flee from us, but bears can read what we're doing and change their behavior accordingly. And so it makes them very, very easy to work with if you can understand their behavior.
So should you keep walking or let the bear do?
I just hold my position. Some people say, keep your eyes on them and back away slowly, but I just hold my position and let the bear do what it wants and just keep facing it and have a neutral face, not trying to stare it down. There's an awful lot of literature out there that says don't stare at a bear. They're very different from the regular social animal that has hard hierarchies. Bears negotiate their way through life because they're interacting with strangers all the time. And if you go to a zoo and you stare at a chimpanzee, it'll go berserk on you. And that's because it sees you as a challenge to its hierarchy. And they have hard hierarchies. And dogs can be the same way. But bears are not. I just keep my eyes on them. Eyes are always your strength. And in any situation that's stressful with any animal or any human, you always want to maintain strength. You never want to show any weakness because animals and humans want to dominate their fear. So if you show any weakness, they'll want to try to control you. And it's just like, I use the example, if somebody got in a bar fight and turned your back on the guy you were fighting with, he'd likely clock you with a wine bottle. But you want to always face your adversary.
Now that's easy for you to say. You weigh 1 ounce more than I do.
It doesn't matter. It's a matter of fact, and it's a matter that all this behavior transcends species. It works on dogs, people, and bears. And it's a matter of understanding it. And if you think that you're weak, you're going to be weak. You don't want to. There's the advice I usually don't give, and a lot of people do give, that if you get attacked by a bear, you go down in the fetal position, or if it's a grizzly bear, protect your neck. I don't give that advice because people mishear it, and they'll go to the ground on a false charge, and that will invite the bear to come over, and usually it's a punishment bite. I've read about bites to each leg, and then the bear walks off. That's just punishment. That's just... That wasn't an attack. That was just because the person laid down, showed weakness, and the bear came over and dominated it, and then walked away. So if the person had stood there and kept eye contact on the bear never would have tried anything like that. And people don't remember things very well. And that's why I like people to think about understanding behavior and how it relates not only to dogs, cats, people, and bears, because all animals, there's certain levels of behavior that transcend all of us. All animals communicate with each other on some level. We couldn't have cats and dogs in our house if we didn't communicate. We might not be able to explain it like we all like to. Might have the science behind it, but it goes on.
We should probably finish up. Maybe one more question, Paul, and then you'll be around then, right?
Yeah.
If you want to hang out and talk, some people probably...
Remind everybody, Debbie's got some books and stuff in the back.
You started on rehabilitating over the years. When you were first starting doing this, you got into this learning, you and the bear just learning, right? How have things changed since then? What over these years have gone by? How did you rehabilitate those first few cubs? As you were just learning what bears...
The question was, how did I rehabilitate the first few cubs and how have things changed? Well, that's the advantage of being dyslexic, is that I have never been one to go off and read a book on how to do something. I've always gone out and observed and used what I see as my information and then go from there. And I can solve every problem there is that way. And yeah, I made mistakes going up, but they always were obvious to me, and the solutions were always obvious. It's a lot easier now. We can handle these cubs and don't have to spend anywhere near as much time. The 8-acre enclosure solves many of the early problems of, the bears. When they had developmental stages. Early on, they would stay very tight, but as they grew older, the bigger the area they wanted to cover, and by the time they're 18 months, they're all over the place. And so there's been a lot of advances. But I think I had the advantage because there was nothing in the literature. They basically said that they were rehabilitating black bear cubs with no human contact and then just dumping them out in the woods at 9 months old and wondering why they weren't surviving. And there was no science behind that either. It was just, as far as I was concerned, it didn't make any sense. I didn't know why humans were so smart that they could shorten the 18 months that a natural mother needed to raise a cub to 9 months or 5 months. And
Yeah.
so,
Thank you.
thank you.